Well, I was a very serious Muslim for most of my life. I took Islam seriously. I had this notion that what's true is true for everyone, not true for you or true for me. Most Muslims don't believe in this relativistic idea. What's true should be believed, what's false should be rejected. And I thought Islam was true. And so I began to talk with everybody about it. Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews I knew. I didn't know a whole lot of Buddhists. I didn't know a whole lot of Hindus, but I knew enough that I would speak to them about it. So I would talk to them about why their worldview was wrong and my worldview was correct. And I was pretty good at this, actually. I had studied Islam enough to be able to sort of answer challenges and offer what I thought was good evidence for Islam. But I also began to study other worldviews as well. And I would challenge them. What I found was actually that most Christians, for instance, that I would talk to, didn't really have any response to what I was saying. So if I began to challenge them on the authenticity of the Bible, or I began to challenge them on how can you explain a God who's a triune being? What does that even mean? Aren't you just a confused tritheist? These kind of things. They would have no response to what I was saying. Sadly, by far, most of them didn't. Now, many of them were nominal Christians. But even those who had professed a sort of a robust faith in Christ, who went to church all the time and who were part of their youth group or whatever, didn't really have a response to my challenges. And so I would knock the faith out of them, or a lot of these nominal Christians, and then I would offer Islam in the vacuum that I created. And I was pretty good at this. There were people that I knew who were beginning to read the Quran as if it were God's word and start to do Islamic practices and identify with Islam. But there were the occasional annoying Christians who actually knew what they were talking about. And they were annoying not because of their mannerisms, although there were a couple of people who were annoying because of their mannerisms, but by far most of the Christians, they actually cared about me. They wanted me to go to heaven. I wanted them to go to heaven. So I didn't want them to believe in Christianity. I thought that the gospel would lead them to go to hell because of these blasphemous ideas like the Trinity and the Incarnation and the crucifixion of Jesus and all these things. But they wanted me to go to heaven. So they began to challenge me back. They knew what they believed and why they believed it. And I found that I had the hardest time with them. But I also had the best conversations with them. Those were the fun ones. So I began to talk with them about these things, and I began to study Christianity. A lot of different worldviews, but Christianity specifically. I minored in comparative religions in undergraduate, but I was taking all these courses and reading all the books I can on comparative theology, the authenticity of the Bible, and these kinds of things. And there were two guys, Dave and Pete. Dave and Pete were two Baptist guys who were going door to door at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, talking about Jesus. They're going to the apartment complexes, knocking on the doors and saying, hi, can we talk about Christ? And, Ann Arbor is a lot like, Berkeley, California. There's a lot of liberalism, a lot of anti-sort of Christian sentiment there. And they get the door slammed in their face, or they get ridiculed, or they get laughed at, or whatever it was. But they came to my door. It was a different story. I was like, oh, hello. Come on in. Enter my parlor, as it were. And Dave and Pete, those two Baptist guys. Dave was real tall, basically had no hair. Pete was real short. Pete was real tall. Dave was real short. Like a walking number 10, like this. They were great guys. I made Dave and Pete extremely uncomfortable for hours and hours at a time. And they kept coming back to our apartment for weeks and weeks. I think it was Thursdays they'd come by. Weeks and weeks. They spanned semesters. They keep coming back. Like the Terminator, they couldn't be knocked down. I couldn't knock them down enough for them to stay down. They kept coming back. I really admired Dave and Pete for doing that because they wanted to see me in heaven. And I wanted to see them in heaven. So we had a really good conversations, plenty of good conversations. And I remember offering them a Quran and them offering me Bibles and that kind of thing, and we would talk. It was during this time that I was walking down the street at University of Michigan on State Street. And there were these Gideons handing out Bibles in the corner, and these little green Bibles. And I snatched one out of Gideon's hand, and I started trying to convert him to Islam. This is a corrupt book, blah, blah, blah. Didn't work. He didn't convert to Islam. But I had a Bible with me. Took it back to my apartment. And I was reading it to find a hole, to find a flaw, to find a contradiction that I could finally show Dave and Pete. This is a problem with your Bible, and you need to see it. And maybe that will keep them down. And when they're down there, then I'll offer them Islam as the way to bring them back up. Well, I was reading my Bible, or this Bible. Again, not to believe a thing it said. Nothing that it said. I didn't want to think that this is God's truth. It was once God's truth, but became corrupted. Muslims believe that Islam teaches that the Bible was once God's word, but became changed over time. And the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, came to fix all that. So I believe it's a corrupt book that can't be trusted. But then I'm reading this book to find a flaw in it, and I came across a passage that really shook me up. You see, for years I've been asking Christians, why are you a Christian? My opening question would be like, why are you a Christian? And they would largely say tradition. I was raised that way. I was born, in a Christian home or whatever. We go to Christmas and Easter services at the Presbyterian church on the street, so I guess I'm a Presbyterian. And so I'd have a follow-up question. Is that a good enough reason to trust your eternal soul to this worldview because somebody else believes it, because your parents believe it? Tradition? And I still think that's a bad reason. But John the Baptist's words were there in Luke chapter 3, verse 7. And he says to those who were coming to him to be baptized, who told you to flee from the wrath to come? Meaning God's judgment. And then he says, think not to say to yourself, you have Abraham as your father, as if that would save them from God's judgment. For I tell you, God can raise up sons of Abraham from the stones. And it hit me. I had been asking Christians, why are you a Christian? And they said tradition. And I said, that's not a good enough reason. Truth is more important. And John the Baptist was saying the exact same thing. Truth trumps tradition. All the times I'd ever asked a Christian, why are you a Christian? They never asked me, why are you a Muslim? I had found all these evidences and reasons to justify my faith in Islam, but I realized something sitting there in that chair with John the Baptist over the 20 centuries it took for him to tell me that through the power of the scriptures. Why are you a Muslim? He asked me that. Is it because of tradition? And I realized that's the main reason. It's because I have to be. I found all the evidences for why I should be, but the real reason was I had to be. So with that slight shift in my thinking now, I wasn't just going to start swallowing everything everybody ever told me about Islam or Christianity. I was going to take it and say, is this stuff true? Or is this stuff false? When Muslims criticize Christianity, are they right or are they wrong? When Christians talk about Islam, are they right or are they wrong? What is the truth here? So I began to look into it. That's when I began to see the evidence. Actually, the evidence came right out of the holy book I had trusted my whole life, right from the Quran itself. See, I had believed that the Bible was once God's word, but became corrupted. But the Quran says, in chapter 5, verse 47, just to name one instance, the Quran says, let the people of the gospel, meaning Christians, judge, present tense, by what God has revealed in the gospel. And those who don't judge by what God reveals, they are among the evildoers or the rebellious. So here's the problem. If the Bible was corrupted and the Quran came to fix the corruption, why is the Quran telling Christians to judge by the Bible? Why is it saying that? If it's corrupted, you can't do that. So I began to look into this and say, oh my goodness, if the Quran affirms the Bible, then the Bible can't be wrong because the Quran's not wrong. But the Bible and the Quran seem to contradict each other. So that's a serious problem. It's what Al Gore calls an inconvenient truth. And I needed to find a way out of it because I realized that if I had to follow the Bible, then I would essentially be abandoning an identity that I've had my whole life. I was a good Muslim. I was somebody other Muslims looked up to. I was an evangelist for Islam, for heaven's sake. And I didn't want to do that. Somewhere inside me, I knew that was the price I'd have to pay. Not consciously, just somewhere inside. Well, as I began to study the evidence more and more, and I began to see the credibility of the gospel, it was bothersome. It was not a welcome thing for me. So I said, if the Quran and the Bible sort of the Quran refers to the Bible as God's word, and they sort of contradict each other, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe it's Christians and Muslims who have had centuries of misunderstanding, and I'm the one who's going to find the common ground. So I began to try to do that, essentially to syncretize the Quran and the Bible. And why? Not because I thought there's some truth to it, but because I didn't want to face the consequences of what a decision would mean for me. So I tried that for a while, to get them to mesh and syncretize. But I began to realize something. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the doctor, of course, is named Frankenstein. The monster has no name. Dr. Frankenstein wants to create life, so he takes dead things. He takes parts of dead things, sews them together, runs a current through it, and voila, he's got life. But it's interesting is the monster doesn't even know its own name. It has no identity, and it hates itself, and therefore hates everyone else who's got an identity. And it goes on a kill-crazy rampage. It results in death. That's what I was doing. I was trying to take Islam and liberal Christianity, things that have no life in them, sew them together to create something that does have life. And what I created was a Frankenstein's monster of a faith. And so I tried to do that for a long time. I began to see that it's impossible. So along this time, some friends invited me to church. And I said yes for some reason. Who knows why? So invite your friends to church. That's the lesson here. I got up that morning early. And I had my Bible out and I had my Quran out. And I had them sticky tabbed and color-coded where they disagreed. I was trying to make one of those disagreements completely wash away. And without too much rationalization, something that I could say, that's a firm agreement on an important issue. And I couldn't do it. I got up early that morning to get one of those things resolved. Because I didn't want to go to that church feeling like I couldn't do it. But I couldn't. So they came in the morning, they got me. I'm a talkative guy, so it's not like I'm the kind of person who gets in a car and I'm quiet. Well, I was that morning. And my friends asked me, what's the matter? What's wrong? I said, it's early in the morning on a Sunday and you guys got me up to go to church. We should do something fun. Let's get out of here. No, you said you went to church. You promised. I said, okay, fine. I'll go to church. So I go. I remember everything about that church service. Everything about it. I had that experience that a lot of Christians have, where the pastor is talking to you, only you. No one else in that room matters. He read your Facebook posts. He broke into your email account. I don't know what he did, but he's got your number. He's talking to you. And normally it's very, very convicting and uplifting because you walk out of there changed and convicted that you got to do something for God, at the end of that kind of a thing. That happened to me that day. But it wasn't uplifting. It was condemning, in a sense. Because here's what the pastor said. He said, God has been leaning on the door of your life for your whole life. If you would just stop leaning back, that door will slam open and he will enter every house and clean it up. He will flood the whole house. And then he asked the question, is that you? And I knew it was me. I knew it was me. And that made me upset because I wasn't willing to undergo the consequences. I wasn't willing to experience the consequences of a decision for Christ. So I walk out of that church service, again, pretty quiet. And I start to hunch over and sob openly in this parking lot. And I begin to sit down and because I feel this weight on my shoulders. I close my eyes and I can see this vision of myself holding up these two enormous books, the Quran and the Bible, like I'm Atlas or something, and they're crushing me. I couldn't hold up the burden anymore. See, I'd created this fence that I was sitting on. I was sitting on the fence, but it wasn't a nice rail fence you can sit on for hours. It was one of those chain link deals with the points on top. So it was very painful to sit on, and I was shifting my weight all the time. And I realized something through that sobbing fit in that parking lot, embarrassing myself in front of everybody, that I hated this fence. I didn't become a Christian that day. What I decided was I hate the fence enough where I was going to decide one way or the other. I wasn't going to die this way. I was going to decide one way or the other. Now, I graduated law school, and all my friends were either in school or working, so I had time on my hands before my job started. My first job as a lawyer was starting soon, but not right away. So I had a lot of time on my hands. So I made it my job to study all kind of worldviews, Christianity, Hinduism, you name it. But really, my main study was Christianity and Islam and the differences between the two. Well, I was sitting at a desk in my parents' den with the evidence for Islam on one side and the evidence for Christianity on the other. And playing behind me on the internet was a debate between a Christian and a Muslim. I was surrounded by the evidence. And I began to ask God, why can't I accept the gospel as true? Because I know it's true in my mind. I know it's true in my mind, but it would not descend to my heart. I couldn't embrace it as true. Why was that? And I suddenly knew right there, as my dad walked by. I saw him right there. That's why. Because the price was too high. Just too high. The moon is this cold, dead rock that's 1/6 the size of the Earth. It's 1/20,000,000th the size of the sun. Yet when the moon goes in front of the sun, it blocks out its glorious radiance. It blocks out its light for the Earth. Why? Because it's so close. The cost of truth, what it costs us to follow Christ, is just like that. It's a cold, dead rock. We hold it so close that it blocks out the glorious sun that God has provided for us. And that's what I realized that day. It's not that I couldn't believe, it's that I wouldn't believe. Because the answers took 9 years, but the answers weren't hard to find. They were just hard to accept. But they were there. They were there. And so when I realized something about who God is and who I wanted God to be. See, a Muslim believes in a phrase, Allahu Akbar, We always hear this phrase in the media. It's not a terrorist chant. It's just a common Muslim phrase. It literally means God is greater. I believed in a God who was greater, the greatest possible being. Every Muslim believes that. And I realized something, finally, after I read Romans chapter 5, verse 8, for God demonstrates his love for us, in that while we were sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. Or Christ died for us, that's what it says. That's a statement about sacrifice, about self-sacrifice. That's the ultimate expression of love. There's no greater expression of love we're capable of. And human beings do it all the time. We sacrifice for those who love us, or maybe for strangers, but usually for those who love us. We never sacrifice for our enemies. We don't love it. We don't know a love like that. But Romans chapter 5 says that God loved enemies so much that he sacrificed for them. So if God is the greatest being, if Allahu Akbar, if God is greater, if he's the greatest possible being, then he would express the greatest possible ethic, which is love, in the greatest possible way, and that's self-sacrifice. If there's a God, he's the God of the Bible, because that's what the God of the Bible, that's what a real God would look like. And it's when I give my life to Christ. No, that took a long time. I started practicing law right after I became a Christian. So I became a Christian in like May or June. I was a lawyer in like June, and I was practicing law. Did that for a long time. It was a good job, great job. Worked at one of the most prestigious firms in the state of Michigan. I went to another very prestigious firm in the state of Michigan and practiced for a long time. Always doing ministry on the side, sort of as a side thing, but always feeling ministry as a calling eventually. And 2 years ago, resigned my partnership, and now I'm a full-time lawyer. Full-time lawyer. Shoot, I resigned my partnership, and now I'm in full-time ministry. My first book, Apocalypse Later, I actually wrote that one right after, on the heels of the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. When I was investigating faith, I converted in 2000. Right before that, there was the Y2K bug. Everyone was talking about, the Y2K bug, and Christians were selling millions of books talking about how it's the end of the world, the institution of the world order, and all these things, end times, end times, end times. Well, this was confusing to me because a lot of them would harp on Israel and the Middle East and always say, Israel's chosen, Arabs are not, and that kind of thing. So it always bothered me because I always thought maybe God's love is not unconditional. It's conditional. It's quite conditional on your DNA. And that's always bothered me because I was looking at the evidence for Christianity and finding it so compelling. Yet I was seeing Christians seemingly, they weren't saying this, but in my view they were saying this. My perception was this. They were saying that God loves certain people more. It's like, well, wait a minute. That doesn't seem to make any sense considering what you think about God. So it bothered me. Well, fast forward now to 2006. After I had become a Christian, I sort of got over that. But Christians were once again talking about the Middle East in terms of an end times theology and what's happening in Israel and Palestine and in other parts of the Middle East. This is all working towards an end times goal. And I began to realize something. Now I'm a Christian and I'm seeing this. I remember the impact that kind of talk had on me as a non-Christian. And I know plenty of Jews who have a negative view of Christians because of their end times theology. They think, you love Israel, but only because it serves your end time theology. Now, I wasn't trying in the book, and I certainly tried as hard as I could to steer away from criticizing one end times theology over another. That wasn't the point. The point was that when it comes to outsiders, we need to stay away from that debate. The debate should stay in the house, but the debate shouldn't get so loud in the house that the neighbors hear. And the neighbors are hearing. And they're not hearing the gospel. They're hearing the wrong, they're stumbling over the wrong block. The gospel is a stumbling block. Have them stumble over that one. So the book is really an urging of Christians to start looking at the Middle East not as a way in which to find fodder for their own end times theology, but as a way to actually take advantage of what's happening there in a good way for the sake of the gospel. Because I firmly believe that only the gospel answers the questions that come from conflict. Because there's 3 questions that come from conflict. The questions of sorrow, justice, and love. Sorrow, because of the loss that we feel, whether it's either side, all sides feel that sorrow. The innocent feel sorrow because of loss of life, loss of liberties, loss of property, loss of freedoms, these kind of things. There's a cry of sorrow. There's a demand for justice because those lousy so-and-sos should be brought to justice because of what they did to us. Very much an us versus them mentality. And then there's the cry for love. I mean, how many times have I heard Arab Muslims say, does the West love us or not? Does their God, who's unconditionally loving, really love us or not? How many Jews have said the same thing about what's going on in Israel, but also through the Holocaust or other things that have caused them to question, does God love us if he lets these things happen? What about anti-Semitism? All these things that happen. Where is the love? Sorrow, justice, and love. And what I try to show in the book is that there's only one worldview where sorrow, justice, and love converge and find their fulfillment. And that's the cross, where Jesus feels the intense sorrow, having felt the wrath of God for the sins of the world, to satisfy God's justice because he loves us. And that's what the apologetic in Apocalypse Later is all about. The Quran doesn't really have very much structure and contour. In fact, it's often been called a contextless book because, and one scholar actually said every fifth sentence doesn't make sense. Not because it's in literally gibberish. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that if you look at the Quran, there's a bunch of laws, and then bam, it launches into a story that sometimes illustrates what the laws are about, but sometimes doesn't. It just goes into a story, and then back to prose or back to law or whatever. So it's kind of hard to actually judge a structural view of the Quran. Now there are structures to it. There are chapter divisions called surahs. There are 114 of them. Generally, they're not ordered chronologically, not even ordered thematically. They're ordered from largest to smallest, basically. So you have the smallest at the end, typically. Not always, but at the end, typically, and the largest at the beginning. So it's not really conducive to a sort of a structure to read from cover to cover. Actually, from Arabic, it's backwards. It's cover to cover. So it's not really conducive to that. But there are some structures in it. So if you want to read the law, you can go to certain chapters of it. But it's really hard to grasp it, to get a hold of it and say, okay, I want to do a sort of the legal aspect study of it, or I want to see the story aspect study of it. It's hard to do that. And you always need a commentary with you, especially if you're reading it in English, because Muslims believe that there is no English Quran. It's in Arabic, and that's the way it is. So it's just a translation, so it needs tons of help. And so you have these commentaries. And sometimes the scholars who have done the work on the Quran will actually say, okay, look, here's where the sections dealing with these themes are. We've pulled them from different parts, and you can study it that way. And some of those are pretty helpful, actually, in that regard. But if you're going to read it cover to cover, buckle up, because it's going to be a bumpy ride. The so-called 5 pillars of Islam are these, they're the standards by which a Muslim is judged to be a good Muslim or a bad Muslim, essentially. It's that which makes you Muslim. So there's 5 basic pillars. It's a very complex system, actually, and each one of these pillars has its own little rubrics underneath it. But the basic 5 are these. The first one's called the Shahada. Shahada literally means to witness or to see. And it's a confession that a Muslim makes, that a person makes in front of another person, and says, I testify that there is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. If you say that in front of another person and you mean it, you're a Muslim. That's it. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is the prayers, the 5 daily prayers. A Muslim is constrained by the Hadith tradition and somewhat from the Quran to pray 5 specific times in the day and in the night. So morning, noon, afternoon, evening, and then night, and in a specific way. It's very ritualistic. It's not like it's sort of free-flowing prayer. It's ritualistic. You face Mecca, you get a rug out, you have to wash before you do it, and you have to wash a certain way. You've got to concentrate. If you break concentration, sometimes you have to start over again. You say the same things largely, the same way over and over again. Not every time, but close to that. And it's not really supplication, nor is it communion with God, as much as it's just you are praying to God for his mercy and forgiveness and acknowledging him for his greatness. And that's 5 times a day, and that's the 5 daily prayers. That's the second pillar. The third pillar is what's called zakat. Zakat is almsgiving. It's like tithing, sort of. Every Muslim who is financially able, who isn't poor himself or herself, is commanded to give at least 2.5% of their gross income to charities or to the poor. The Shiite Muslims, who are the minority, they do it a little more. They have an extra thing called hummus. They add a little extra to it. But 2.5% is basically the rule. The fourth pillar is what's called Sawm, or the fasting. During the month of Ramadan, which is just the name of a month, it's the month in which Muslims claim the Quran was revealed. Muslims are called to fast. They can't eat or drink anything. They can't ingest anything that's physically gratifying. No gum chewing, for example. And they have to refrain from sexual gratification as well, from sunrise to sunset for that 30 days. In the evening, they can eat all they want, and they do. More food is consumed during Ramadan than any other month of the year in the Muslim world. But it's a lunar calendar. So Ramadan moves 11 days every year. It moves back compared to our solar calendar. So sometimes it's in December, and sometimes it's in July. So if you can imagine what it's like to be in Saudi Arabia where you can't eat or drink anything from 5:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night in the blazing hot sun, that's pretty tough actually. It's a time for spiritual purity, for identifying with the poor, and that kind of thing. And then the fifth pillar is what's called the Hajj. Hajj is the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every Muslim who is financially and physically able is required to make at least one pilgrimage to Mecca where they circumambulate the Kaaba in the Grand Mosque. It's this big black cube. Most people have seen this on the news or in some sort of media piece where there's a big black cube and the Muslims circumambulate it. Millions of Muslims come to the Kaaba at a specific holiday and they worship God at this area. They do a lot of other things too, like they go to this one stone, they think they represent Satan, and they cast stones at it, and they do a lot of other things as well. And those are the 5 pillars, from prayer and the Shahada to the fasting and the Zakat, all the way to the Hajj. Now, jihad is sometimes called the 6th pillar of Islam. Jihad is an Arabic word that literally means struggle. Doesn't mean war. Doesn't mean holy war. It means struggle. There's 2 kinds of jihad. There's the greater jihad, according to Islam, which is the jihad against the self. It's the inner struggle. The struggle against, if you're addicted to pornography, dealing with pornography. The struggle against lying or to try to maintain an integrity, to be compassionate to the poor and these kind of things, and to strive against greed. That's the greater jihad. The lesser jihad is the one we're more familiar with, the idea of holy war. Muslims are commanded in the Quran to give of their property and of their person to fight in God's cause. Now, many Muslims believe that it's a defensive thing only, but a lot of Muslims, and I shouldn't say most, by far most Muslims are not jihadis. They're not sitting around, hiding in dark corners, twisting their mustaches, thinking of ways to blow up airports. They're just not doing that. But there are some who are. Clearly, we see that in the world. We can't be naive about that. And that is the idea that you fight the infidel, you fight the non-Muslim until they either submit and become Muslims themselves, pay a tax called the jizya tax, or the third option is death. And that's what jihad is. By far, most Muslims don't actually ascribe to the second jihad. They really ascribe to the first jihad. And most Muslims don't even want to think about that. Really, they're just peaceful people who just want to live their lives and move on. Growing up as a Muslim, especially an Arab Muslim, I heard this thing, talk about religion or politics, and I was, what else is there to talk about? I mean, my goodness, the most important things in life are these things. You're not going to talk about this? Okay. Well, the first thing I would do is form genuine relationships. Don't form a relationship for missionary purposes. I had my missionary caseworkers that I thought, oh, my friends, they're my missionary caseworkers, and I knew it. But form a genuine relationship. If they never convert, stay their friend. Just do that. See if what you can do. One of the benefits to Muslim evangelism is the food. Take advantage of that. They're such hospitable people. They love to shower you with food. They'll give you the shirt off their back. They're incredibly hospitable people. So enjoy that and be hospitable back. Form a real relationship. But next, realize something. They're not made of porcelain. They're not going to shatter the minute you throw a barb their way. They're okay. They might get loud. But that's part of the culture. I mean, my culture is loud and expressive. I mean, I'm Mediterranean. That's what I do. I get loud and expressive. I'm not mad. I'm just loud and expressive. But they're not afraid to talk about these differences. They recognize them. Now, some will say, oh, we all believe in the same God and all these things, and that's something that they say. But they will eventually recognize some very fundamental differences. I think as a Christian, what you can do is when you form a relationship with a Muslim, or even if you don't have one with a Muslim, you just want to, you're sitting next to them on the bus or something like that, and you want to talk to them about something, and maybe they wear the scarf. So if you're a woman and you see a woman wearing a scarf, ask her, why do you wear that? See where it goes from there. Ask them questions. Share the culture. Be interested in the culture. Be interested in the religious faith. And then you can ask the question of a Muslim. It's almost so easy, it's almost silly that I'm going to say this. What do you think of Jesus? Because they have an opinion. They have a strong opinion about Jesus. Because they believe he was a prophet. They believe he was sinless. They believe he was sent by God. They believe he was the Messiah. What they mean by that is something different, but they believe that he was born of a virgin. They believe these things about him. So we have a commonality, Yet we squander this by hiding behind the idea we can't talk about politics or religion. Sure we can. They love talking about it. So while our maybe secular friends don't want to talk about religion, our Muslim friends definitely do. And it's a great way to have a real, good, honest, and fun conversation. It's sprinkled throughout the Quran. You see all throughout the Quran. You see it in chapter 2 of the Quran. Lots of references to Jesus and to the prophets of old. You see it in chapter 5 of the Quran. In fact, some of the most compelling things about the gospel and the Torah are in chapter 5, talking about how Jesus was sent and he came with a book that confirmed the previous scriptures, and the Quran confirms those previous scriptures as well. You see that in chapter 5. Chapter 3 has some mentions of him as well. Chapter 19 of the Quran is called the Surat Maryam, or the chapter about Mary. It goes into the virgin birth stories. So there's plenty of places. It's hard not to find one, actually. There's lots of places. Josh was coming to the Dearborn International Arab Festival. A lot of missionaries were coming there, but Josh heard about it and said, what a great way to share the love of Christ with Muslims. So he came and he had a meeting with a lot of the missionaries who were already working there. One of the things I admire about Josh is he doesn't do what a lot of other ministries do. They just come in and say, whatever you're doing, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. A lot of them do great work, don't get me wrong. But Josh had a meeting with the missionaries and in the churches who were already actively working with the Muslims in the area and said, what are you doing? Here's what I plan on doing. Do you think it will help? And if it doesn't, I don't want to be there. I don't want to mess it up. So we had a breakfast, and I first met Josh McDowell that way. I handed him a copy of my first book, actually, realizing he gets handed a lot of things I'm not going to hear from him again. And I actually handed him a little press kit about my ministry. Again, realizing he's not going to read this thing. So much to my shock, 6 months later, maybe 4 months later, I get an email from Josh McDowell saying, I'm going to be in Dearborn. Want to have lunch? Yes, I do. So we had lunch, and we hit it off. And sort of an aside, my wife, we were going in the full-time ministry, and my wife said, all right, we're having a fundraiser. We need a keynote speaker who can be a draw. You need to ask Josh, can he be our keynote speaker? Will he help and mentor you on some things? And will he take a look at our press kit and see what he thinks of it? So I walk into this Arabic restaurant in Dearborn, and there's Josh McDowell sitting there in shorts and a really bright-colored shirt. Surprise, right? And he greets me. We sit down. First thing he says to me is, I got your press kit here. I have some comments. So I didn't even ask him that question. Then he asks me, so how do you raise funds? So we have a fundraiser, an annual fundraiser. He goes, do you have a speaker? I said, not yet. He says, I'll do it. And I'll do it for free. It's like, holy cow, I'm dizzy now. Because I'm like, I was going to ask you that. And then he said, would you like some help? Maybe some suggestions here and there how to do the ministry? Because this can be a very tough thing. So, bam, the mentor thing was happening. Since then, we've been close. Just been close. He appreciates, I think, the attitude with which we approach apologetics and evangelism ministry. And we just hit it off. And I've gotten to know Sean through him. I'm so blessed by that relationship as well. And Josh has just been a tremendous blessing to us. And we had a successful fundraiser, if you were wondering. And just a real blessing. And he did the forward for my book. I barely even had to ask him that one. I think he expected me that I was going to ask him, and he said, I'll do a forward for your book. Great, Josh, I can't wait. So that's how that happened. So the book came about, I was asked to do a series of talks on competing worldviews for a really large church in Michigan. They said, can you do some talks on different religious worldviews and non-religious worldviews? Just talk about 3 different worldviews and compare them to Christianity. So I started to do that. And I compared secular humanism, pantheistic thinking, from Hinduism to Buddhism to every other ism within the philosophy, and the New Age, of course, and then Islam. And as I was doing that, I began to see some really important things emerge. All worldviews have to answer 4 main questions. How do we get here? What's the point of being here? Why are things the way they are down here? And is there a way out of here? Is there a better life? And I began to see these commonalities, and those were the fundamental questions. But what I started to see really was every worldview has what I call the grand central question it's trying to answer. Its central question that it tries to answer and claims to answer better than everybody else does. So I'll give you an example. Secular humanism. Secular humanism is the worldview that human beings are inherently valuable and objectively valuable beings. That's the humanism part. But secular, you don't need God for that. You don't need God to give you that value. I began to see this as almost oxymoronic. You can't have human value without an objective moral value giver. So they wanted to answer the question, how do we ground or justify human dignity? And I want to affirm that question. That's a great question. It's a seminal question. It's a grand central question. And my thesis is this: for every grand central question that's out there, for every worldview, the Christian worldview affirms the question and then offers a better answer. So I wanted to say it's only in the Christian worldview, not a theistic worldview, not just belief in God that grounds human dignity, but belief in the God of the Bible that specifically grounds human dignity. No other belief will do it. Just the God of the Bible will do it. And so that's the one section there. And then I do that for pantheism and what its central question is, and Islam as well. And if you can caricaturize a worldview in 5 minutes and debunk it in 5 minutes, you probably don't understand it. Or you do when you're being deceptive. What I'm trying to do in Grand Central Question is show Christians and non-Christians, it's meant for non-Christians especially, I always write with non-Christians in mind, that you don't need to understand every nuance of a worldview to communicate truth to that worldview. Just understand the central question you're trying to answer. And all the peripheral questions will eventually get answered, but the central questions are the ones that need the answers most. That's a great question. I've actually been thinking about it a lot lately, something similar to that, so I'm really glad you asked it. The first thing is this: do it for the right reasons. Now, my evangelism heart comes out here. I think apologetics is a tool to serve evangelism. Sure, it's great to withstand the challenges of our day. We need to do that. We need to have a robust worldview that can withstand the challenges of our day. But we need to do that so we can stand strong, so that those who don't agree with us will eventually see the beauty of what we believe in and the credibility of it. And then we can make enemies into friends. And friends for Christ, not just our friends, but friends for Him. So do it for the right reasons. I think oftentimes people get involved in this kind of stuff for sort of, geeky, apologetic-y, geeky kind of conventions where a bunch of apologetics geeks talk to each other about apologetics geeky stuff, as opposed to training ourselves to talk to a lost and dying world. So I think we've got to get into it for the right reasons. Second, always understand that you're not trying to win an argument. I think this is something apologists and Christians who are fervent about the gospel fall victim to. I try to stay away from this all the time. It's hard. It's very hard. Even now, I've been doing this for a long time, and I still try hard to remember I'm trying to win the person, not the argument. If you're trying to win the argument, well, then you're doing it for the wrong reason. But if you're trying to win the person, well, you're doing it for all the right reasons, and the Holy Spirit will be there for that. So that's a second thing. And the third thing that I think we have to understand is this is an endeavor that is a mind-heart bridge. I think sometimes we can make it too heady. Like if we just have the right argument, just the right persuasive articulation of what we believe or whatever it might be, that somehow they'll just see the beauty of the argument, they'll see the credibility, and then bam, they'll convert. There's no magic bullet like this. Not at all. Because we don't realize the price of truth. And if we see that and we see the heart component to it, I think we'll get a lot farther than we've been getting. We've been answering a lot of questions, but not answering a lot of people. Something interesting, because Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 to 6 is now sort of the guiding verse for my apologetic. 1 Peter 3:15, great verse to center an apologetic on because of the idea of how we share the faith, the reason for the hope within us, but with a meekness and respect. But at the same time, I think there's something missing from we just take that and say, just argue nicely. But Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 to 6 is an interesting phrase. What Paul says there is, be careful how you walk towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer each person. He doesn't say how you ought to answer each question, because questions don't need answers. People need answers. Remember something, you're not in the question answering business, you're in the people answering business. And that's what this is about. So those are the three things I think an apologist should really keep in mind, is that it's mind-heart, it's people-based, and it's all to serve God and glorify His Son. Some really great stuff to begin reading on, I think, is some of the introductory level stuff that will get you to get some of the more meaty stuff. So a book like The Case for Christ for Lee Strobel, excellent book because it goes into a fully orbed view of who Christ is. The Case for Faith by Lee, another great book. It's another great book that's written by Mark Mittelberg called the 10 Questions Christians Hope No One Will Ask, with answers. Great introductory stuff for apologetics. Anything C.S. Lewis ever wrote. Excellent stuff. And I can't think of one person who would disagree with that. Anything he ever wrote. Ravi Zacharias' books, also excellent reading. He does a great way of taking the tough questions and making them pliable for the tenderhearted. And I think that's what we have to do as for an apologetic. So stuff that Ravi Zacharias writes. For some of the more rigorous sort of logical thinking, how do we get through this stuff kind of thing, I think in the philosophical views, William Lane Craig stuff, whether it's Reasonable Faith, his introductory book, or On Guard, great stuff. For the more rigorous minded, you have quite the hefty tome by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland called Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview. That's a slugfest. You got to get through that, but it's worth every minute you spend. So I would recommend that as well. On other world religions and other worldviews, a book by James Sire called The Universe Next Door, also a great book on this kind of thing. So there's great books out there. There's some great websites as well. I think of str.org, Stand to Reason's website, great website. Our website's embracethetruth.org, got some stuff there. Just really some really brilliant stuff to get you going. I think beyond a ministry like Summit, the Summit Oxford programs, these are great places to go, where you'll have a nurturing atmosphere that's still challenging. You'll have that. I think these are great places to go to. But there are institutions of higher learning that are just really, honestly, doing such great work. They're challenging. They're not pushover places. They're not, oh, you're a Christian, therefore it's going to be easy for you. It's going to be tough, actually, for you. I can think of a couple. Biola University, of course, with their master's degree in apologetics, but also just their undergraduate curriculum was a nice way to get centered on this. Liberty University has got a PhD in apologetics now as well. Houston Baptist University has some great faculty there. On the undergraduate level, Lee Strobel's there, Mary Jo Sharp, Mike Lacona, some of these really big minds. And then where I'm teaching now as visiting professor at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Oklahoma Wesleyan has now opened the Josh McDowell Institute for Christian Thought and Apologetics. And the undergraduate level is exposed to this, but they're actually forming with William Lane Craig a master's curriculum in apologetics. So I'm going to be a part of that, and of course William Lane Craig stuff is top flight. So you're going to get a master's degree program at Oklahoma Wesleyan University as well. So there's great options out there. There really are some great options out there for anybody who wants to take this and go to a higher level. You don't need a passport to be a missionary anymore. Some of the best ways to actually get engaged in cross-cultural missions is to break out of the sort of Americanism of it's our way or no way kind of a thing. Walk across the street, go across to the cubicle, go to the locker next to you, whatever it is, and ask a foreign person a question about their heritage. Or better yet, learn one word in their language. I'll tell you, you want to be a rock star among Arabs, learn how to say hello. I'll teach you right now. Marhaba. If you learn how to say marhaba, they'll be like, marhaba, oh my goodness, and they'll give you free food. It's great. It's cross-cultural missions. You've taken an actual interest in who they are. Not for the sake of conversion, but for the sake of who they are. So learn some of the language. Ask them a question. Say, I'm really curious about this. Or I've heard you're really hospitable people. Why is that important to you? Just engage in that. And then invite them to your house. I think oftentimes, a lot of times, people are afraid they won't come to my house because it's too Western or I don't serve the right kind of food or whatever it is. So walk up to them. If you get a relationship with them and say, hey, we're going to have dinner at my house. Do you eat certain kinds of foods? If you do, I'm happy to accommodate that. I'd love to see how we live. And then they might reciprocate and invite you. By the way, when they invite you, and they're going to, say yes. Go. And by the way, when that weird food's in front of you, just eat it. I mean, honestly, just eat it. Just do it. You might love it. You might love it. You might not, but be polite. But there's great ways to engage in this kind of stuff. It's just show a genuine interest in the person and in the culture that they come from. So for Epiphany dawned on me was a friend of mine was going to the Lebanese restaurant. in a town called Royal Oak in Michigan, and he was like, "Man, I want to break through with these guys and just get them to, I'm not just a customer. I want to get to know them better." He said, "What can I do?" I said, "Learn how to say marhaba. Learn how to say hello. Say marhaba. So when they walk in, say marhaba." And they go, marhaba! And they're going nuts, and then all of a sudden, when you go over there, they'll give you free sandwiches. And he said, I'll tell you what, I can get a free sandwich out of it, but I got free fries with my meal. I got free falafel. It came with it. So, yeah, man, they feel isolated in this country sometimes. It's like we have to be us and they have to be them. But when you see like a mixing of it, man, they turn around. They turn around in so many ways. It's not a magic bullet, but it certainly gets you farther than, let me talk to you about the 4 spiritual laws. Okay, but how about first you get to talk to them about who their kids are?